This is Disc 4 of 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. Chapter 6. It takes 3 seconds to quit stewing and start doing. You can't build a reputation on what you're going to do. Henry Ford.
Everybody talks about writing a book, my dad used to tell me, but precious few glue themselves to a chair and actually do it. He's right. After writing a couple dozen books myself, people often tell me about the books they're going to write, someday. Almost weekly I'll hear from somebody that says, I'm going to write a book, I just need to find the time to write it. Some of the same people have been saying this to me for years. I must confess that I know the feeling. It happened for me in the final stages of my doctoral education. I was reaching what is known by every PhD student as the ABD period, all but dissertation. This may sound like a momentary rest stop on the way to completing an advanced degree, but for far too many students, it winds up being the end of the road. You see, after completing all the coursework, there is this looming task of researching and writing a monstrous thesis. It's a paper that will be critiqued by committee members that are looking to flex their own academic muscle in front of each other. And sadly, the intimidation of this prospect results in a significant number of intelligent students never completing their project. They talk about it, they read about it, they plan to do it, but they never sit down and actually finish it. It's a syndrome common enough to be researched and is characterized by several tendencies. Worry about ever finishing, the sudden and overwhelming feeling that your topic is boring and insignificant, depression when the data doesn't fit the hypothesis, and unfavorable comparisons with other graduate students. I think it was the fear that I might fall into this syndrome that propelled my dad to fly from Chicago to Los Angeles to meet me for the better part of a day to talk about how I was doing with my dissertation. Dad, a college president, knew the ABD syndrome well, and I think he sensed me drifting into a potential elongated stage of it when we were talking about it on the phone. I have some ideas that I'm considering, I told him, but I'm not exactly sure I've found the right subject. Dad always listened patiently as I worried out loud about which topic would sit well with my academic mentor and my future dissertation committee. I've heard brutal stories of some students that have to rewrite their entire project, I told him. But all my fretting about writing a dissertation came to an end one afternoon in the coffee shop in the Century City Plaza Hotel where Dad and I were having lunch. He listened, as usual, as I bandied about some topics I thought I might eventually examine. He nodded with understanding as I described the potential problems of having certain scholars serve on my committee. He sympathized when I told him how difficult it was to concentrate in our noisy little apartment with no air conditioning. But eventually, my dad leaned over the table and said what he'd traveled halfway across the country to say to me. Son, you can talk all you want about what could happen if you did your project on this or that, and you can carry worry about the politics of your committee all you like. And I know you can find plenty of reasons the process of writing this dissertation is going to be tough. Then he paused for a brief moment as he looked out the plate glass window next to our table, as if to measure his words. Then he looked straight at me. But you will only write your dissertation when you stop talking about it and start doing it. I knew he was right before he even finished his sentence. It wasn't a revolutionary thought, I know, but something about the way he said it, the way he looked at me in that moment, made it more than a mere thought. It was a message he came to deliver in person, and it touched a part of me that was directly linked to wherever my motivation is stored. Suddenly, I knew with certainty what needed to be done. It sparked in me a decision to quit complaining and take action. It was the kick in the seat of the pants I needed to dedicate myself to my goal, no matter how intimidating it had become. And I did. That very day I committed myself to a topic and jumped in with both feet. I was determined to do whatever this dissertation would require and not come up for air until it was complete. I committed myself to action. I had purpose. That evening I talked with my wife about my intentions, and we both agreed that together we'd do whatever was necessary to put normal life on hold to get through this project. We agreed to make sacrifices together. We unplugged our television for starters. We put our upcoming vacation on hold. We created a space and a schedule where I could give myself to writing. I stayed up late, finding that my most productive hours occurred after most everyone else was asleep. In other words, we paid the price by rearranging our life to accomplish this goal. That's when I moved from merely talking about my dissertation to actually writing it. The project became my passion, and without intention I became the first in my class to complete the dissertation. That wasn't part of the plan. It just happened. I finished it a year earlier than either my committee or I anticipated, and it was all because I decided to stop stewing and start doing. Why are so many of our plans arrested at the idea level? Because it's the first impulse to delay action. All of the first impulses in this book are easier to follow than the second ones. But in the case of stewing versus doing, most of us find that the distance between the two impulses is especially significant. I've always appreciated a particular line of poetry from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It hangs on a subtle little plaque in my study. The heights of great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night. I've read Longfellow's words often through the years, usually in the wee hours of the morning while writing a book. They inspire me to keep going as a writer, even when the words come slowly and all the world seems fast asleep. From my experience, I understand this struggle. I know the ebb and flow of energy that comes even when you're sincerely dedicated to action. I know the agony of delaying gratification. I understand the effort required to resist distraction and discouragement. But I also know that if I hadn't learned this lesson, if I had always merely talked about what I intended to do someday, I'd have ABD instead of PhD after my name. For that matter, if I hadn't learned the lesson of putting in the hard work, you wouldn't be reading these words, because the book would still be just a great idea. As you might guess, it was written in the wee hours, in spite of the temptation and struggle to put off the task and merely talk about what I intended to write the next day. Taking action, whether it is writing a book, losing weight, starting a business, standing up to your boss, or training for a marathon, is tough. Many of us stop short of action. But the person who is willing to do whatever it takes knows that they will have to pay the price and commit themselves to achievement even when it's not easy. What are your intentions? It seems that it would be easy to differentiate between stewing and doing. In reality, though, it can be pretty tough. The line can be subtle. Gathering information can be a form of action, but after a certain point it becomes a way to avoid doing anything else. Discussing plans can often help clarify them. But once again, we have to determine when discussion turns into procrastination, and some of us just try to be doing something, even if it's not moving us closer to our goals. But that's not action. It's busyness. Nothing ventured, nothing lost? Back in 2002, a friend told me about a product he'd come up with and wanted to market it on the web. It sounded like a great product that would definitely fill a niche, and it would probably make him a whole lot of money. I told him how much I liked it and I encouraged him to carry out his plan, but 3 years later, in 2005, it was still an idea. The problem? It involved writing. As in, seat in the chair, pen to paper kind of action. The product would take a couple of days to create and probably be about 20 to 30 pages of writing tops. But once it was done, it would be done. He could then sell it over and over again. Sadly, putting those words on paper became an insurmountable obstacle. Of the Mount Everest variety. He simply would not sit down and write. He would talk about it with trusted friends. He would list all the ways it could become a lucrative business, but he never did more than talk. On the outside looking in, I had a better perspective on where this was going. Nowhere. He spent all the time he could have been using to implement the plan on refining it. He was obviously stewing and not doing. Since it was his idea and his business, I just watched and kept my mouth shut for a while. But then I had an idea that I thought might help him. I suggested that the product might be much better produced in a video form rather than on paper. He immediately warmed to the idea and got started. He found the cameraman, the tape duplicator, the website designer, everything. He was ready to roll. That was this time last year. Is the product on the market? No. Has the first frame been shot? Nope. Is he making money? Of course not. Why? Because there are other ways to stew. He'd taken a first step, but he now stayed there, balancing precariously and still looking up at the mountain to climb. You know the type. They get everything down on paper. They've researched names, places, costs, feasibility, but they never stop researching. It's like the guy who wants to buy a new TV. He checks consumer ratings, he researches prices, he measures the space, and then figures out what furniture needs to be bought to hold it. Then, while he's doing all this, someone comes up with flat-screen technology and he has to start over from scratch. Busyness versus accomplishment. I recently read about a very busy man. Winter, yes, that's his legal name, a freelance computer programmer, has an unusual mission. The Houston, Texas native has made it his goal to drink coffee at every Starbucks in North America. He's been doing this since 1997. And at this writing, he's had a caffeinated beverage in 5,774 active company-owned Starbucks stores in every state except Hawaii. He's also had a cup of joe in 306 international locations, including Japan, England, Spain, and France. Winter, who was featured in a recent documentary, achieved a personal record in 2006 when he visited 29 different Starbucks in one day, downing 104 ounces of coffee and 3 shots of espresso. How did he feel after that accomplishment? Well, pretty early on, I started developing a headache. I started feeling jittery. Later, because of all the liquid I drank, I started feeling bloated. Just looking at a little cup of coffee made me nauseated. He must have a good reason to spend most of his discretionary income, close to $30,000, on this mission, right? Not really, as far as I can tell. His goal appears to be to do something unique. Although in one interview he did say that he was inspired by a conversation with a Starbucks barista about the company's rapid expansion. Part of it is my collector's instinct, he said. Once I get into collecting things, I have to have it all. I'm big into comic books, cards, and coins. Essentially, I'm collecting these Starbucks, and I'm compelled by my instinct to get them all. This is a man who's working hard. He's willing to sacrifice his time, his money, even his health to achieve his goal. To me, this makes Winter a perfect illustration, admittedly dramatic, of a person who keeps extremely busy while accomplishing nothing of value. I have a busy friend who actually feels complimented when you tell him he looks tired. Been pushing hard, he'll say with pride. Know somebody like that? They view busy as a badge of honor. Why? It has to do with something we psychologists call secondary gains, or the benefits that we might unconsciously be seeking. The primary or conscious gain that we receive from busyness is often productivity. We feel productive because we look productive. But just under the surface, we may be pursuing busyness because it alleviates some anxiety. Being too busy might even provide the excuse we need for not doing something we fear failing at. Because being busy gives us license to arrive late, slip out early, or be absent altogether, we can rationalize that we don't have the time to do what would help us realize our dream. Crossing the line from stewing to doing. Like my ABD colleagues at the university, many of us have at least one thing we talk about, plan, or worry about, but never take action on. How about you? What do you dream of accomplishing that you can't seem to get started? Name one specific goal for this season of your life. Then, as you read through the following process, keep that goal in mind. By taking the time to apply the process to your dream, you have the potential to make progress and leave the stewing behind. Number 1. Confront the most common reason for stewing: fear. The motto of everyone who is stuck stewing instead of doing could be, "Nothing ventured, nothing lost." Uttered out loud, these words sound absurd, but many of us live our lives according to them, even if we never articulate them. They allow us to rationalize inaction. They cause us to question decisions. They extinguish every good intention. What underlies this inertia? I believe most stewing can be traced back to fear of failure, of success, of loss of control. It is the number one reason for motivational paralysis. So many of us talk a good game but never take action because we're afraid of some disaster that could result. If you've never looked at your stewing in this way, such thinking may be new to you. We tend to have a lot of excuses, from laziness to poor time management. But examine yourself. You may discover some fears that, if eliminated, can free you to start doing. I told them to tell my parents and the children that I loved them if anything went wrong, said David Page after the incident. In September of 2004, the British man spent 4 hours facing what he believed was imminent death. It all started when he picked up a rusty piece of metal in a Norfolk, East England workyard. Noticing its cylindrical shape, he suddenly realized that it looked a lot like something still occasionally found in England: unexploded ordnance. Not every bomb dropped on the country in World War II exploded. Every so often a child or a farmer or a man in a workyard would find an unexploded bomb. Authorities took this seriously because the danger was real. Page called emergency services on his cell phone, and police, fire, and ambulance crews rushed to the scene. As the operator kept him on the line, the terrified man told her that he was afraid the item would detonate if he put it down. She kept saying it would be okay, but I kept saying to her, "You're not the one holding the bomb," he later told reporters. Hours later, emergency crews were able to examine the item. and they found that they had just rescued the workmen from an old car part. David Page's fear was real, it's just that the threat wasn't. When it was finally examined, it was shown to be harmless. Likewise, the disaster that you most fear might, if rationally examined, prove to be avoidable. Can you name a fear that has paralyzed you? By now you probably know that you've got to conquer it or it will conquer you. The first step is to examine or articulate your fear. Say it out loud. Write it down. Bring it into the light of day. Now challenge your fear. Ask yourself, is it rational or irrational? Is it productive or destructive? In what areas of life does it rear up most often? Career, relationships, parenting, household projects? A great way to logically examine a fear is to talk it over with a trusted friend. Ask him or her to punch holes in your fear. Why do this? Because caution grows weaker in the light of rational inquiry. Almost all fears fade when they're dragged out of the darkness, and often the very act of naming and confronting your fears empowers you to conquer them. As simple as this sounds, you'll notice that a miraculous thing happens as you articulate your fears and drag it out into the harsh light of day. You'll feel less afraid. You may even feel liberated, as if a weight has been lifted from your shoulders. If you have a habit of responding to fear without really thinking about it, you'll need to do this more than once, and probably with quite a few fears. But every time you name a fear and challenge its logic or usefulness, it will weaken, and you'll establish a new habit of confronting rather than reacting to fear. Number 2, make a list of goals, including some impossible ones. This is a good second step because often new goals emerge after you remove the impediment of fear. Now, I can almost hear you groaning at the idea of writing out your goals or dreams. After all, you may be saying, we're talking about taking action, not writing in a journal. I understand, but give me a chance here, and let me see if I can convince you of the value of this exercise. The year was 1966, and Lou Holtz, at the age of 28, was out of a job and had no money in the bank. Not only that, his wife Beth was 8 months pregnant with their third child. She gave him a copy of a book she thought would lift his spirits. It was called The Magic of Thinking Big by David Schwartz. There were so many people, and I was one of them, says Holtz, who don't do anything special with their lives. The book said you should write down all the goals you wanted to achieve before you died. Holtz took the author's suggestion to heart. Sitting at his kitchen table, the 28-year-old coach listed 107 goals that, at the time, seemed ridiculous, from having dinner at the White House to appearing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, from meeting the Pope to winning a national championship. He even included making a hole-in-one and jumping out of an airplane. According to Henriette Ann Clouser, in her book, Write It Down, Make It Happen, Lou Holtz has achieved 81 of those 107 goals. He met the Pope, he appeared with Johnny Carson, he has photos of his dinner with President Ronald Reagan at the White House, and he's made not one, but 2 holes in one. Do you think Lou Holtz would have achieved these goals had he not written them down? Doubtful. Clouser's book, she recounts story after story of real-life people who have accomplished amazing feats after writing down their dreams and aspirations. She says that whenever a person writes down their dream, it is like hanging up a sign that says, "Open for business." I love the true story of Jim Carrey, who walked into Hollywood as an unknown aspiring comedian, wrote a check to himself for $10 million. On the memo line, he wrote, "For services rendered." For years, he carried the check with him, and imagined the day he would receive a real check just like it. Of course, today he is one of the highest paid entertainers in Hollywood, garnering $20 million per film. So here's my challenge to you. Even if you're not a believer in this exercise, I want you to compose your own list of goals, aspirations, and dreams. For the moment, give no thought to how practical or realistic they may be. Write down even those ambitions which seem far beyond your reach. Write fast. Don't linger over each item. Just brainstorm and think big. Richard Bowles says, one of the saddest lines in the world is, "Oh, come now, be realistic." I agree. Don't worry about being realistic as you write. Just write. Number 3, count the cost. After finally completing my PhD, I've been able to write more than a dozen books myself. I certainly believe that gluing myself to my chair one time made it easier to do again. But writing a book has never been easy. In fact, I believe that anything worth doing is hard. I wonder if so many people stew over overwhelming tasks because they mistakenly believe that those tasks should be easy. Like maybe that one person is just unlucky and everyone else can do great things with little or no effort. Counting the costs is not natural, especially when we're starting out and enthusiasm is high. It's easy to brush the price aside and focus on the reward, but they're supposed to be weighed together. We should choose to start acting on our goals, not because there will be no difficulties, but because the rewards make the difficulties worth enduring. Number 4, aim for the finish line, but take it one step at a time. I see far too many people with great goals get discouraged along the way because they focus on how far the finish line is. Instead of marking their progress with the mile markers along the way, they only see how far they have to go to achieve their main goal. Don't fall for this. You've got to break any significant achievement into manageable steps. It's fine to keep the big payoff in mind. In fact, it's imperative. But don't allow the big goal to keep you from seeing the little goals that will take you to it. Fear can be a factor here, too. If you've never learned how to break down a task into smaller steps, the larger task can easily appear overwhelming and frightening. I don't know how exactly Lou Holtz got from sitting at his kitchen table, unemployed, to sitting down to dinner at the White House with the president, but I can tell you it wasn't in one big leap. Often what looks impossible when viewed in its entirety can be a lot more manageable when you break it down. Number 5, reach the point of no return. I know I just said that success is rarely achieved through one big leap, but often the first step is the biggest. That's because it represents a commitment. Imagine yourself inside the cockpit of an airplane before takeoff. For the past few minutes, you've listened to the pilot and first officer as they went through a lengthy takeoff checklist. Now the plane is accelerating down the runway. Just before the wheels leave the ground, one of them calls out V1. If you're not a pilot, this acronym probably means nothing to you, but in aviation, V1 is the takeoff decision speed. Before a plane reaches that speed on the runway, the pilots can still choose to abort takeoff in case of an emergency. After the plane reaches V1, the plane must take off or risk disaster. Any emergency will have to be dealt with in the air. Every self-starter understands the value of a V1 commitment. With every new venture, you go through your own kind of checklist. Once you've thought about it, prayed about it, talked about it, written about it, and so on, you must commit yourself to doing something. When a would-be entrepreneur actually gives notice at his job, he has committed himself. When a student applies for the Ivy League school, she's acted on her intentions. When a couple accepts an offer on their house, they are committed to a move. Any goal worth achieving will have at least one step that is not retractable. If you're not willing to take that big step, to leap off into the unknown, so to speak, then you never truly commit yourself to the process. And it's that much easier to get sidetracked by stewing behaviors. Number 6, learn and refine. Failure is a dirty word in our culture. When our attempts fail, many of us don't blame only our decisions on actions. Instead, we define ourselves by the failure, creating a kind of guilt by association. It's as if the stain of failure penetrates deep inside us and changes who we are. It causes pain and discomfort and seems to have no redeeming value. If that's how you see failure, then it makes sense to avoid it at any cost. But it may come as a surprise to hear that many truly successful people who are willing to do whatever it takes not only have failed, but they are actually good at failing. They count the costs of failing in a way, expecting it and writing it into their plans. By their definition, failure is a necessary step toward growth, so they welcome the discomfort, knowing that they can learn from it and have a better chance of success on the next attempt. Great examples are everywhere in sports. You don't become a professional in any field by allowing a loss of failure to define you. Instead, the best athletes search for what they can learn from the loss, then refine their actions. In their book, Now Discover Your Strengths, Marcus Buckingham and Donald O. Clifton write, "Really, what is the worst that could happen? So you identify a talent, cultivate it into a strength, and fail to perform up to your expectations. Yes, it hurts, but it shouldn't undermine you completely. It is a chance to learn and to incorporate this learning into your next performance and your next." That's a great perspective. You can free yourself to stop stewing by embracing the possibility of failure when it becomes not a disaster to be avoided, but an opportunity to improve. Number 7, make room for serendipity. Once you commit yourself to achieving this goal, you may notice something strange. No, I'm no mystic. People who know me well can vouch for that fact. I'm a man of practicality. But what I'm about to tell you may make you think otherwise. Here goes. When a person takes the time to write down their own list of unattainable goals, they not only activate something in their brain, but something in the cosmos as well. I'm not talking about the silliness of psychic phenomenon. I'm more inclined to see this occurrence as divine intervention, and it's one that's well documented. Let me explain. My good friend John Maxwell once told me about an unattainable goal he had as a young pastor in Ohio. The success of his church, then one of the fastest growing in the region, necessitated a $1 million expansion of the church building. The task seemed impossible. Before the bank would give the church a loan, he needed to raise $300,000 from the congregation. The most he'd ever raised for a project before that was $25,000, and at just 29 years of age, he had no experience in a major building program. He was facing the impossible, but he practiced the process I've mentioned here. I wrote down the goal, he told me, and after a lot of prayer, I made a decision to go for it. Then he pulled out of his pocket a laminated card that he'd obviously had for years. I carried this card with me every day for 18 months, he told me. I read it every day, and it helped me stay focused until we met our goal, far quicker than I ever imagined, by the way. On the card were the following words from William H. Murray. The moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issue from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance which no man could have dreamed would have come his way. Have you ever experienced this? Once you make a decision to leave your comfort zone, cross the starting line, and commit yourself to something bigger than you think you can accomplish, providence begins to move. You begin to observe the law of serendipity, a phenomenon in which the impossible becomes possible for no plausible reason. Consider Alexander Fleming, the scientist who discovered the antibacterial properties of penicillium mold when it grew on an old culture dish that he'd left behind while on a holiday. If Fleming had covered his old experiment, if he had placed it in a warm incubator, if his lab was not located one floor above a mycology lab, and if London had not had a cold spell that allowed the mold to grow, he might have returned and thrown away the culture dish as he had tidied up. Time magazine, in its 2005 issue celebrating the world's 100 most influential people, said this about Fleming. A spore that drifted into his lab and took root on a culture dish started a chain of events that altered forever the treatment of bacterial infections. Fleming had been researching the antibacterial properties of common substances for several years. He thus had the experience to recognize what he saw. Still, you can't deny the serendipitous circumstances. The law of serendipity has been obvious in my own life. A year ago, I wrote down one of my goals, to produce a DVD series that would train couples as marriage mentors. Not only did several serendipitous meetings occur to get it started on a fast track, but within 3 weeks of putting the idea on paper, I sat next to a complete stranger on an airplane who asked me about my work. When I told him about this particular project, he pledged to help fund it. A week later, a chance meeting with a TV producer led to the offering of state-of-the-art studio time. Over the next few days, I received several unsolicited emails from couples who ended up being perfect interviews for the video shoot. I never imagined the project would materialize like it did, and it never would have if several unplanned serendipities hadn't occurred so quickly. Plainly put, the law of serendipity is the experience of having 2 or more things happen coincidentally in a manner that is meaningful to the person experiencing them. It differs from coincidence in that serendipity implies not just a happenstance, but an underlying meaningful pattern. In applying this to your list of unattainable dreams and goals, you'll soon discover that implausible connections begin to occur shortly after you commit yourself to one of them. You'll meet someone who can open a particular door for you, or you may find that a phone call you make to someone comes at the perfect time. And you'll also discover that the more committed you are to your dreams and the more willing you are to step out in faith, the more commonplace these amazing serendipities become. It takes 3 seconds to quit stewing and start doing. Deep down, you know that if you want to change and grow and become the person you want to be, you need to get started. And yet, that first step can seem so daunting. After a recent lecture I delivered on the subject of this chapter at the university, one of my students asked me if I was a Trekkie. A what? A Star Trek fan. I had to confess that I'd never seen a single episode of the television series or any of the Star Trek movies. He was disappointed but told me that I'd like the ship's captain from Star Trek, Next Generation, Jean-Luc Picard. Why's that? I asked. Because he has a catchphrase that sums up this idea you were talking about in your lecture. Whenever he orders his crew into action, he says, "Make it so." Now, I may not be a Trekkie, but I like that phrase because it's the sentiment of every self-starter who has learned to stop stewing and start doing. They've battled their first impulse to fret and stew and dedicated themselves to making it so. I don't know your story. I'm sure you have plenty of legitimate reasons to complain and whine. You may have a million reasons not to get started, but none of them can be as compelling as the rewards of success. In a month or a year or 5 years from now, you may have only one regret, that you didn't start now. And it all hinges on the 3 seconds that are required to make this choice. So, I've got to ask, are you ready? You can decide right now to resist the impulse that says someday, and instead, you can make it so, starting today.
Conclusion. How to make your second impulse second nature. Leap, and the net will appear. Julie Cameron.
James Bryant Conant, who was a significant player in the Manhattan Project, the team that created the atomic bomb, as well as the president of Harvard and the U.S. ambassador to Germany after World War II, was fond of saying, "Behold the turtle. He only makes progress when he sticks his neck out." Conant was a pioneer at bringing new thinking and practices to the organizations he was part of, and he believed that personal and professional progress always involves a little bit of risk. I agree, and I'm guessing that you do too. But I've got to be honest with you about a fear I've carried with me as I've written each chapter of this book. My fear is that you would study the 6 impulses that never pay off, that you would commit yourself to leveraging the 3 seconds that get you to whatever it takes, but that you would only do so when it's easy. In other words, I fear that you might only stick your neck out when it doesn't take much effort. After all, the second impulses, to disown your helplessness, to embrace a challenge, and so on, can come relatively easy on occasion for decent people. But when the going gets tough, I fear you may let your second impulse fade fast. For example, I fear that when feeling especially helpless, you will give in to this impulse by shrugging your shoulders and saying, "There's nothing I can do about it." I fear that when you are facing a particularly big challenge, you will surrender to your first impulse by saying, "It's too tough to even try." While wanting to fuel your passion, I fear that you may still sidestep your vision and give way to an impulse that says, "I'll just do what comes my way." And I fear that when you have an opportunity to walk the extra mile at work or at home, you may become too distracted or too tired to resist the impulse that says, "I've done what's required and that's enough." And finally, I fear that when it comes down to trading in stewing for doing, you will perpetually give in to the impulse that says, "Someday I'll get to that, but not now." Each of these impulses is self-sabotaging. They do nothing to elevate your life. They are in a sense a way of smugly saying, "whatever," to life. And yet, day after day, many of us give in to them over and over again in spite of the deleterious results. So when it comes to you, personally, are my fears grounded? After reading this book, are you still likely to have a whatever attitude and miss out on what your life could be? Probably not. After all, here you are in the concluding chapter. You wouldn't be here if you weren't serious about this practice. But let me remind you that just reading the book doesn't guarantee positive outcomes. You have to practice the principles you've studied by following through even when it's tough. And that's when I fear I may still lose you to the first impulse. Let's face it, change, deep-seated, abiding change, is always risky. The true test of giving these 6 impulses the boot is found in your ability to let your second impulse emerge when almost everything within you resists. When your first impulse is hanging on strong, lingering far more than you want, you are going to have to dig your heels in and reverse your course. You are going to have to take a risk. Risky business. It's always tough to trace the origin of a term, especially when it's used as slang. But I got to thinking about the use of whatever. When did people start using this phrase to convey an attitude of disinterest? You hear it a lot these days. For example, "He thinks it's my fault, but I was like, whatever." Or you may hear it as a flippant kind of rebuttal, as in one person saying, "There's no way I will stand for that." And the other person simply replies, "Whatever." And sometimes it's said drawn out with great disdain, as in, "Whatever." It's all attitude, and it conveys a complete lack of concern or interest. It's derisive, dismissive, and disingenuous. And when it's accompanied by the rolling of the eyes, it can become downright contemptuous. I did some research on the word's origin, and the best I can tell, the phrase was first used in this manner in the 1971 film The French Connection, the classic crime drama starring Gene Hackman as Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle. Whether my research on its origins is accurate or not doesn't really matter. The phrase succinctly sums up the popular attitude of apathy. Now, I know you wouldn't be reading these words if you were content to live an apathetic, whatever life. I know you want to move beyond the 6 first impulses I've exposed in this book, but I want to remind you that you will only do so effectively if you stick your neck out. I probably don't have to tell you at this stage that the second impulse is indeed risky. Think about it. When you disown your helplessness, you risk responsibility. When you embrace a challenge, you risk losing face. When you fuel your passion, you risk the comfort of what's known. When you own your piece of the pie, you risk taking the blame. When you walk the extra mile, you risk being exhausted. And when you quit stewing and start doing, you risk failure. Each of the 6 secondary impulses can never be obtained without sticking your neck out. But it is in this risk of doing so that you will make personal progress. As someone said, the greatest risk is playing it too safe. Each time you come out of the safety of your shell, past the protection of your first impulse, you move closer to whatever it takes. Making your second impulse a habit. When it comes to the 6 areas I've covered in this book, we must cultivate our second impulse if we are to be effective. That means we must practice each of these impulses until they become, quite literally, second nature. Effectiveness is a habit. It's built on a practice, like the mechanics in the pit stops at the Indy 500 who make their decisions before the race begins, and then practice their drills. And by the way, practices can always be learned. As the great management guru Peter Drucker said, practices are simple, deceptively so. Even a 7-year-old has no difficulty in understanding a practice. But practices are always exceedingly hard to do well. They have to be acquired. Ask any piano teacher who is teaching her pupil the scales, or any student who is learning multiplication. It is in repeating ad nauseum that 6 times 6 equals 36 until it has become an unthinking conditioned reflex. That's when a practice becomes a firmly ingrained habit. And according to Drucker, practices are learned by practicing and practicing and practicing again. Just as you can learn to play scales on the piano, you can learn to instinctively disown your helplessness, embrace a challenge, and all the rest. You can acquire competence in any practice you are willing to work at. So here's my suggestion. Review the table of contents of this book and identify the one impulse of the 6 that you would like to change most. Which one of these practices would you like to master? Perhaps you are especially drawn to fueling your passion, or maybe it's walking the extra mile. Whichever one it is, circle it. Now, of the remaining 5, identify the second impulse you'd like to practice most. Circle it too. And this is your assignment. Focus on these 2 secondary impulses. Practice them, and practice them again. You don't need to neglect the other 4, but give these 2 special attention. Start small with small risk. Don't expect perfection. Maybe you won't be able to resist the pull of the first impulse every time. Just keep practicing. The piano student improves incrementally. As long as you keep taking the risk and seeking the second impulse, you'll be growing. It may take a while, but the second impulse can become second nature. To every practice applies what my old piano teacher said to me in exasperation when I was a small boy, said Drucker. You will never play Mozart the way Arthur Schnabel does, but there is no reason in the world you would not play your scales the way he does. Drucker added, what the piano teacher forgot to say, probably because it was so obvious to her, is that even the great pianist could not play Mozart as they do unless they practiced their scales and kept on practicing them. So remember this. An impulse is nothing more than a sudden instinct that prompts you to act or feel. It is an abrupt inclination. It's not premeditated. That's why, when it comes to the 6 impulses that never pay off, we need to wait a second, or 3, before giving them credence. We need to make an advanced decision to choose a higher path and honor the 3 seconds that can make or break any situation where these impulses emerge. You need to throw your weight behind a second impulse that allows you to disown your helplessness by saying, I can't do everything, but I can do something. Embrace a good challenge by saying, I'm willing to step up and give it an honest try. Fuel your passion by saying, I'll do what I'm designed to do. Own your piece of the pie by saying the buck stops here. Walk the extra mile by saying, I'll go above and beyond the mere minimum. Quit stewing and start doing by saying, I'm diving in, starting today. These are the impulses that either make or break us. This is the power of thinking twice. Just 3 seconds separate those who give it their all from those who don't give it a thought. This brief buffer is all that stands between settling for whatever and settling for nothing less than whatever it takes.
You're listening to 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. This concludes this disc. Please proceed to Disc 2 for the continuation of the program. You're listening to 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. This concludes this disc. Please proceed to Disc 3 for the continuation of the program. You're listening to 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. This concludes this disc. Please proceed to Disc 4 for the continuation of the program. This is Disc 2 of 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. This is Disc 3 of 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. This is Disc 4 of 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott. You've been listening to 3 Seconds by Dr. Les Parrott, read by the author. Produced and directed by Jeff Bowden for Zondervan New Media. Recorded at Victory Studios, Seattle, Washington. Mixing and CD mastering at Zondervan Studios, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Recording copyright 2007 by Zondervan. This production contains the complete text of the book 3 Seconds, copyright 2007 by Dr. Les Parrott. All rights reserved. Unauthorized duplication is prohibited by law. This Zondervan audio production is for your personal learning and enjoyment. You may play up to 5 minutes of the production for an audience in non-commercial settings as long as you include with it the title, subtitle, author, publisher, and website address www.zondervan.fm. This Zondervan audio production is also available in a printed book edition at your local bookstore. For a complete listing of all Zondervan audio productions, visit zondervan.fm. Any other reproduction, streaming, downloading, broadcasting, or copying requires written permission. Address all inquiries to zpermissions@zondervan.com.